2005, Todd Guy was 22 years old. He lived in Michigan. He was an avid outdoorsman. He liked to go deer hunting. He loved to catch trophy fish, and he loved his family. And routinely, after he moved out of the house, he would drive on the weekends the 5 miles north to his parents' house and would spend lots of time with his parents and his extended family. On June 11th, 2005, Todd was visiting his parents at their house. He was there for dinner, and after dinner, he went back to his house. He checked in with his roommate, who was actually his cousin, and then following that, he drove to a local bar to get a few drinks. At about 9:30 that night, he decides to leave the bar and walk to this big orchard where there was this huge annual keg party that he and his friends would go to. He leaves his car at the bar, and he walks to this orchard, and it's perfect weather. All of his friends are there. He's having this great time, and he's there all the way until midnight. It was getting late. Todd felt tired, so he told a couple of his friends that he was going to head home. He was going to leave his car at the bar, and he was just going to walk back to his house. The area that this orchard was in was right near his home, and so he knew this area extremely well, and it was only about a mile south to walk to his house. So all of his friends said bye to him. They said he seemed totally normal. They watched him walk south towards his house, and that was the last anybody saw of him. On his walk home, Todd would make 4 phone calls to friends and to family. And the last one he made was at about 12:45 in the morning, and it was to his friends, and he told them that he was in a field and he couldn't breathe. And they kept asking him, like, what are you talking about? And all they heard was very heavy breathing on the phone. They couldn't tell if it was his or if someone else had taken the phone and was now breathing into it. But then the phone cuts out, and they tried calling him back, and there was no answer. They couldn't get in touch with him. The next day, when Todd did not show up at a family get-together, something he never would have missed unless he told them ahead of time, his family knew something was wrong. Plus, they had those strange phone calls the night before. They checked in with his friends. They said, yeah, we haven't heard from him. They went over to his house. He wasn't there. And so that's when they called the police. A massive search is kicked off involving canines and helicopters, and they're not finding anything. 3 weeks after Todd had gone missing, a couple was walking around this lake that was located north of the orchard where Todd was at that big keg party. And the wife looked out into the water, and she said she thought she saw something bobbing. She couldn't tell what it was, but it was just this weird object that stood out to her. And she and her partner walked down to the edge of the lake, and they looked out. And at first she thought it was a person who was swimming, just kind of bobbing up and down, because their body position was such that their shoulders and head were totally out of the water. And so it was a strange sight, and they knew that it didn't seem right. So they called the police. Police show up, and it turns out that this person was Todd Guy, and they were deceased. When searchers found out that it was Todd Guy in the lake, their reaction was, no way. We have witnesses saying he was walking south after he left the keg party. Why is he in a lake way to the north of the keg party? It's in the complete opposite direction. Also, investigators were baffled at his body position, because if he was a drowning victim, you would expect him to be face down in the water, as most drowning victims are. But for him to be upright, shoulders out of the water, it doesn't make any sense unless there's ice in the water to kind of prop him up, and there wasn't any ice in the water. His toxicology report showed that in addition to alcohol in his system, he had a very high dose of an antidepressant, something that he wasn't prescribed, and he didn't have any history of mental illness and had never been prescribed any antidepressant in his life. His body was pristine. It did not have any of the hallmarks, the bloating you would expect from being in water for 21 days. In fact, it was concluded that it was impossible for his body to have been in the water for all 21 days that he had been missing. His autopsy showed that he had almost no water in his lungs, even though his death was classified as an accidental drowning. When the news broke that this was an accidental drowning, the family and friends pushed for a closer examination of this case because it wasn't adding up. And so a noted pathologist looked at all of the evidence and determined that at most, Todd had been in the water for maybe 3 days, and he had almost certainly been deceased when he was placed in the water, which is why there wasn't any water in his lungs, and it's potentially why he was in that position that he was in, that upright position. So, as you'll see in all of these cases, why are we calling it an accidental drowning still? And where was Todd from the day he went missing for those 15 to 17 days before he was placed in the water? And what did he mean when he was on the phone the night he went missing and said he was in a field and couldn't breathe? And what was all that breathing in the background? Lots of questions on this one. On January 25th, 2017, 23-year-old Dakota James was out bar hopping in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with some buddies. At some point, he was tired, and so he decided to walk home. A CCTV camera has a clear shot of Dakota James after he left the bar, walking through a plaza. He's on his phone. No one seems to be following him. He seems like he's okay. He's not stumbling as he makes his way home. The next day, when he didn't show up for work, that was so out of character for him that his work immediately called the police, notified his parents, and this massive search is launched. But unfortunately, nothing turns up. 40 days after he had gone missing, his body was found in the Ohio River 10 miles away from where he had been missing. And the general theory became, when he was walking home after that CCTV camera picked him up, he must have stopped by the water to relieve himself, fell in. The water was so cold at the time that he would have gone into shock and then basically been doomed. And then he drifted 10 miles to this location. But there's a couple big issues with that. Number one, in order to get from where he went missing to where he wound up, he would have had to go through this dam. And the dam is this very violent section of water where if a body were to go through there, it would get ripped to pieces. But when they found his body, it was clear he had not gone through a dam. In fact, his body was pristine. It looked like he hadn't been in the water for very long at all, despite 40 days elapsing since he had gone missing. When his toxicology report came back, he had alcohol in his system as well as a high level of GHB, which is a very powerful sedative. And like you'll see in many of these cases, he had no water in his lungs, but this was ruled an accidental drowning. The family was unwilling to accept that as a cause of death, so they went out and hired a world-renowned forensic pathologist named Dr. Wecht to come in and analyze all of the evidence, look at the autopsy report, and try to see if there's anything that was missed. And what Dr. Wecht finds is on Dakota's neck, there were ligature marks, as if rope or some sort of twine had been wrapped around his neck, which was later disputed by the other medical examiner who said that was dried blood, but Dr. Wecht swears there was ligature marks on his neck. Dr. Wecht also concluded that there was absolutely no way, based on decomposition levels, that Dakota was in the water for more than a couple of days. And he believed that he was dead or unconscious when he actually went into the water, which is why there was no water in his lungs. So it begs the question, if we believe Dr. Wecht, where was Dakota from the day he went missing until 37 days later when he apparently went into the water? And again, why are we calling this an accidental drowning when he didn't drown? Lucas Holman was an incredible athlete, 6'3", incredible at baseball, football, and basketball, which was his primary love. In fact, he was so good in high school that he was recruited to play at a Division I program, the University of Wisconsin. And in fact, he got a scholarship to play there. So he went to the University of Wisconsin. When he wasn't getting much playing time there, he opted to transfer early on in his career to lacrosse, which was a Division III school, but he figured he could get more playing time that way. It was at this time that he realized, you know what, I'm probably not going to play basketball professionally. And so he began orchestrating his life towards a career in finance. And in fact, was telling his family that once he graduated school, he was actually going to get a master's degree in business at the University of Wisconsin. On September 29th, Lucas and his friends are at this huge German festival, drinking a ton of beer, having a great time. At some point in the night, they transition to some of the bars downtown, and they're all having a great time. It's very crowded. But at some point in the night, Lucas disappears. No one knows where he went or who he was with, but Lucas was a big, confident guy. They figured, you know what, what's the worst that could happen to him? I'm sure he's fine. And so his friends ultimately just go home and don't think much of it. The next day, when no one could get in touch with Lucas, his friends and family called the police and said, you gotta look into this. We don't know where he is. The police went to the strip of bars that they had been bar hopping between, and they asked to see the security footage from the night before. And in a very unfortunate coincidence, all of these bars, their cameras were down. So they weren't able to get a glimpse of where potentially Lucas might have gone. At one point, someone came forward and said that they knew where he was and that they had spent time with him outside of the bar, but it would later turn out that that person was lying and they were actually charged with submitting false information to the police. On the 2nd of October, divers located Lucas's body. He was in 10 feet of water about 20 feet from the edge. When they pulled him out, he didn't have any significant scratches or marks on his body to indicate some sort of altercation. It just looked like he had fallen in the water and drowned, and so his death was quickly ruled an accidental drowning. The initial medical report said that Lucas had fallen in the water and had been there for about 24 hours before he was found. But upon closer examination, it was determined that he had only been in there for maybe 8 to 12 hours. So he's only been in the water for a few hours. Meaning there had been at least a few days where he was not in the water and was alive. In the toxicology report, it showed that he had a high level of alcohol in his system, as well as, like Dakota James, a high level of this sedative called GHB. Also, it was noted that his belt buckle had been tightened way tighter than he normally wore it, and some people speculated that it looked as if someone else had tried to dress him, maybe after he was deceased or when he was unconscious. And then perhaps the strangest part of the case is the day after Lucas had gone missing, his roommate, who had been in the room the whole time that Lucas and his friends had been out at Oktoberfest and going to the bars, he'd been home the whole time, he goes to bed and wakes up to an alarm. But it's not his alarm, it's Lucas's alarm. It's his phone going off that's underneath Lucas's bed. Lucas definitely had his phone while he was out. But somehow his phone got under his bed, but Lucas was not there and had never been there in the night unless he managed to sneak into the room without waking up his roommate and place his phone under the bed and then leave again. It didn't make any sense. Police would never subpoena the phone's records to find out where it went that night, so we're left wondering how in the heck it got under his bed if he was never in there. And like all the other accidental drowning cases that we're looking at, where was Lucas from the time he went missing on the 29th of September and then wound up in the water at some point on the 2nd of October? He was alive for those few days and he wasn't in the water. So where was he? Some people say that these accidental drownings and all the others that are going on, these suspicious accidental drownings, are actually the result of a group of serial killers known as the smiley-faced killers, who leave smiley faces around the area where bodies are discovered. That's still very much up for debate. Other people say that there could be something paranormal going on, or this really is just a case of some drunk college kids slipping into the water and drowning. But it's up to you to decide what you think is going on. I'd love to hear in the comments what you think, and I'll get back to all the early commenters. So get in there and let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, and you haven't done this already, please slightly overcook the like button's popcorn and subscribe to my channel. And
18-year-old Aaron Blocker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was January 2011, and the Mississippi College freshman was doing his best to pay attention in his chemistry class. Chemistry was usually Aaron's favorite class. He dreamed of being a scientist himself. But today, he was distracted. His stomach was cramping, and he really had to go to the bathroom. Aaron had Crohn's disease, an illness that causes stomach cramps, severe weight loss, and diarrhea. He'd been diagnosed the year before, but for the past few weeks, he'd been suffering from a prolonged flare-up. Already this morning, Aaron had left the lecture hall 3 times to go to the restroom. Aaron tried to ignore all the twisting and churning that was going on in his stomach and just listen to the lecture, but pretty soon Aaron realized he couldn't ignore it any longer. So, like he already had 3 other times so far this morning, he quietly got up and began heading for the door again. But as Aaron climbed the stairs that led out of the lecture hall, he tripped over a backpack and nearly fell. Now, immediately, Aaron heard people laughing at him in the classroom, but that didn't really bother him, because all Aaron was thinking is, thank goodness that was not worse. Aaron had always been a bit uncoordinated, and he did fall kind of a lot, and unfortunately, he was very prone to breaking bones from even the mildest of impacts. As a child, he had managed to break his nose, his fingers, and his wrist, and he had also dislocated several joints. Thankfully, though, on this day, Aaron did reach the doors of the lecture hall in one piece, and then once Aaron was out the doors, he hustled his way down the hall towards the bathroom. 2 nights later, Aaron sat in the college cafeteria across from his girlfriend, Emily, who he had been dating for nearly a year. Aaron was a grade ahead of Emily, so she was actually still in high school. She was a senior. But his college was not far from her home, and so she came to visit him whenever she could. Emily had just gotten her first tattoo, and she was telling Aaron all about the experience, but Aaron was having a really hard time focusing on her story. The distinctive sort of greasy aroma of sloppy joes and tater tots filled the busy dining hall, and it was making Aaron feel really nauseous. He was on a restrictive diet because of his Crohn's disease, and the cafeteria's very greasy food was brutal on his stomach. But his dorm didn't have a kitchen, so he really had no other choice but to try to eat as much as he could handle. As he tried to force down some food, his stomach suddenly spasmed and Aron clutched his belly in pain. Emily saw this and stopped her story and asked if he was okay, but Aron sort of brushed it off. He said he was used to the pain and told her not to worry. But this time, the pain was just too much, and Aron doubled over in agony as another spasm cut through his gut. Emily shot up from her chair and put her arm around him, and then whispered to him that he really needed to go see a doctor. And Aron nodded and told her that, his abdominal pains had been getting worse and worse for days. And so Emily gathered up all their things and then called a taxi to take them to the nearest hospital. A couple of hours later, Aron laid in a hospital bed in the emergency room with Emily sitting by his side. The doctor had ordered an immediate CT scan of Aron's abdomen, and so now they were just waiting for the results. Aron clutched Emily's hand and let out a deep breath. He was, unfortunately, quite used to hospitals, doctors, needles, and machines. And in virtue of being Aron's girlfriend, Emily, too, was very accustomed to this environment. Aron was very grateful to have his girlfriend by his side. And so he looked up at Emily and he told her he just could not imagine going through all this stuff by himself. But before she could reply, the ER doctor came into the room with Aron's test results. And the doctor got straight to the point and said he'd found something very troubling in Aron's CT scan. But it was actually not Aron's gut that was concerning the doctor. He said during the CT scan, as they're trying to photograph his abdomen, the scan had kind of inadvertently caught a bit of Aron's hip bones. And basically, the bones showed signs that they were dying. It's a condition called avascular necrosis, which happens when blood supply to a bone is cut off, and so the tissue decays. Aron closed his eyes and grimaced. He wondered if maybe this condition he'd never even heard of might explain his history of so many broken bones. Aron quickly filled the doctor in about his medical history, and how doctors had really struggled to figure out why his bones always seemed so brittle. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, Aron had been tested for various conditions, from common issues like arthritis to a rare genetic condition called Wilson's disease. But each time, the results were either negative or inconclusive. It wasn't until Aron was diagnosed with Crohn's disease a year ago that Aron finally got an answer that sort of made sense. His doctor had told him that because his Crohn's disease had been untreated for so long, Aron had been malnourished, and as a result, his bones were weakened. But that was a year ago, and since then, Aron had done everything in his power to eat right and build up his strength, and so it just seemed like, he would have been doing better by now. The ER doctor listened closely and took a bunch of notes. Then, after Aron was done speaking, the doctor asked him if he was taking any new medications. And Aron nodded and said that yes, for the past 8 weeks, he'd been taking low doses of a steroid called prednisone to help reduce the inflammation caused by Crohn's disease. Aron could see from the ER doctor's expression that he was puzzled. The doctor said that steroids could cause bone damage like this, but only with prolonged use and high doses. In his opinion, 8 weeks was just not enough time to cause this much damage to Aron's hips. But just to be safe, the ER doctor recommended that Aron go see the other doctor who'd prescribed him this steroid to see if maybe they could change his treatment plan. Aron's mind was swirling. He had convinced himself that if he could just get his Crohn's disease under control, he could live a normal college student life. But now here he was being told he had an even bigger problem with no clear solution. And so Aron shook his head in disbelief. But at the same time, he tried to stay positive. He hoped that if he stopped taking steroids, his bones would stop breaking down and he would get better. 2 years later, on a muggy summer day, Aron clutched the sticky vinyl seat of a campus shuttle bus. Every time the bus hit even the smallest of bumps, Aron would feel pain shooting through his hips. Aron was now 20 years old and working hard towards his degree in biology and medical sciences. It was fascinating to him to learn how the human body worked. He hoped that someday he'd know enough to understand what was happening to him. Because Aron was still in constant pain. His weakened hips made it really hard for him to walk around campus, so he took the shuttle bus as often as he could, even though it was quite painful. Right after visiting the emergency room 2 years earlier, Aron had stopped taking steroids, but that hadn't helped, and his hips had only gotten worse. At this rate, Aron knew he could be facing a hip replacement surgery before he even turned 30 years old. When the shuttle bus came to a stop, Aron carefully climbed down the steps and limped into the lobby of the school's medical building for an appointment with his orthopedist. He sighed as he shuffled his way into the very familiar waiting room. Doctors and nurses and hospitals were now as much a part of Aron's life as college professors. A few minutes later, Aron hobbled into an exam room and climbed up onto the crisp white paper covering the examination table. When the doctor arrived, he asked Aron to lie down, but Aron was in so much pain, the doctor had to actually help him lie down. After poking and prodding Aron and also guiding Aron's legs through several movements to check his range of motion, the doctor stepped back and grabbed Aron's latest scans and began looking them over. And as he did, Aron could tell he was very likely about to hear some bad news. He had seen that same concerned look on many doctors' faces in the past. Finally, the orthopedist lowered the paperwork and told Aron that his avascular necrosis in his hip bones had continued to worsen and it was leaving behind a lot of dead bone tissue. And so he wanted Aron to consider a surgery called core decompression to remove the diseased bone in Aron's hips. Once the dead bone was gone, new blood vessels could develop and healthy bone could grow back. Ideally, this procedure would reduce Aron's pain and help him avoid total hip replacement surgery down the road. Aron was so desperate to feel better that he only had one question. How soon could they schedule this surgery? 8 weeks later, Aron was at home in his small off-campus apartment, studying in bed. He hadn't been able to move much since his surgery, and he was irritable at how slow his recovery had been. He was having trouble focusing on the biology textbook he was reading, so he put it down and reached for the TV remote. But when he clicked the power button, the TV wouldn't turn on. Aron wondered if maybe the remote's batteries were dead, so he carefully swung his legs over the side of the bed, grabbed onto his headboard, and pulled himself upright. Then Aron grabbed the aluminum walker right next to his bed that he needed just to get around, and he inched his way across the room to his desk. He pulled 2 AA batteries out of the desk, but then he dropped one of the batteries as well as the back of the TV remote onto the floor. And Aron suddenly thought to himself, what is he going to do? Getting down on the floor on his hands and knees was just totally out of the question. It would not only be very painful, but he also might not be able to stand up again. And so Aron just suddenly felt overwhelmed by how much pain he was in, how inconvenient his life now was, and also just the fact that 2 months after surgery, it just did not feel like he was getting any better. But just then, Aron heard the key in the front door, and a moment later, his girlfriend Emily called out his name. Aron was so relieved that she was there. He yelled that he was in his bedroom and he could really use some help. Emily came into the room and she could see that Aron was very distraught. She helped him back into his bed and then reached under the dresser to retrieve the battery and the back of the remote. Emily suggested that Aron just close his eyes for a half hour and she'd make him some lunch. Aron smiled and felt so thankful to have Emily in his life, and then he did close his eyes. But Aron was too anxious about his situation to fall asleep. It felt like his life's goals were slipping away from him. Aron had had to take time off of school after the surgery, and he didn't want to delay getting his degree any longer. And so he really just had to find a way to get better soon, or else the future that he longed for with Emily just wouldn't be able to exist. One month later, a nurse at the orthopedist's office led Aron into an exam room and closed the door behind them. Aron attempted to climb the tiny step stool in front of the examination table like he had done so many times in the past, but this time the pain in his hips was so extreme he just couldn't do it, so he opted for a chair instead. A minute later, Aron heard a soft knock on the door and his orthopedist came in. The doctor pulled up a stool in front of the room's computer monitor so they could look at the results of Aron's latest CT scans. Once the doctor had pulled up the images, he pointed to the balls in both of Aron's hip sockets, and then he pulled up another image of a healthy hip joint to compare. The doctor said that on the healthy hip, the ball and socket looked like a smooth round sphere surrounded by space. But on Aron's hips, the balls looked broken down and fractured. The joints were surrounded by white shadows that represented scar tissue that had grown and grown over the years. This was obviously not what the doctor or Aron had hoped for. The bones in his hips were grinding together and continuing to break down, which meant the core decompression surgery was a failure. Aron asked the doctor why his bones kept decaying no matter what doctors recommended, and the doctor admitted he simply didn't know. The doctor said the next step would be a double hip replacement surgery. But he assured Aron that although it was unusual to replace hips in someone so young as Aron, it was a common surgery with great results. And so he told Aron that after his surgery, he would very likely be able to walk easily again and his pain would be gone. But despite that, this was still a very difficult decision for Aron. If he went through with the hip replacement surgery, he would need up to a year of recovery and rehab, which would mean putting his schoolwork on hold again when he was so looking forward to graduation and doing scientific or biomedical research in the real world. And so this was going to be a really challenging decision. But then Aron stood up to go get his jacket, and his hips hurt so much just walking the 3 feet to the coat hanger, Aron realized he really had no choice here. The pain was so bad and it was only getting worse, and so he basically had to do the hip replacement surgery. 4 years later, in 2016, the clock radio on Aron's nightstand belted out a pop song, jolting him awake. Aron rolled over and hit the snooze button, and as he did, he smiled. Before his hip replacement 4 years ago, rolling over would have been so painful, but now he was moving just fine. It had taken a long time to become this healthy again. Following the hip replacement surgery, Aron had to stop going in person to school and take online classes in order to finish his degree on time. He spent his time mostly indoors and bedridden, but slowly he had regained his mobility and had gotten his life back on track. Aron had graduated from college and was now pursuing a master's degree in biomedical research at Mississippi College. At the age of 24, 4 years after the surgeries, Aron was finally focusing on his future rather than his pain. Through it all, Emily had stayed by his side, like always. And at the end of 2012, Aron asked her to marry him, and to his delight, she had said yes. They were married on August 1st, 2013, the best day of Aron's life. Aron could hear Emily in the kitchen cooking up some breakfast. A moment later, she called to him and asked if he wanted some eggs. Aron yelled back that he'd be right there as he put his slippers on. Just then, Aron's alarm clock went off again, and without thinking, Aron twisted around to stop it. And as he did, he suddenly felt an excruciating pain in his left hip. The worst pain he had ever felt in his entire life. Aron instantly writhed in pain and fell back on the bed and shouted for Emily. She rushed into the bedroom and tried to help Aron stand, but he couldn't move his left leg at all because the pain was now totally unbearable. And so through gritted teeth, he asked Emily to hand him his phone, and when she did, Aron called a friend, and a few minutes later, that friend arrived, and together with Emily, they helped lift Aron up and carried him out to the car so they could drive him to the hospital. An hour later, Aron lay on a gurney staring up at the hospital ceiling lights flashing past him as the ER staff whisked him down a hospital corridor to the CT scan room. Aron had hoped that these emergency visits were behind him, but here he was again amidst the smell of disinfectant, the high-pitched sounds of equipment, and very sick people just like him. In the scan room, technicians helped move Aron's aching body to the motorized table, making Aron groan every time they touched him. As the table began to move, Aron could hear buzzing and whirring noises as the machinery took images of his hips and midsection. Even lying there was painful, because Aron had to clench his muscles to keep his legs perfectly still. Once the scan was over, Aron clenched his teeth in pain as the technicians shifted him back onto the gurney and then wheeled him back to a waiting room. And after an agonizing hour of waiting, a doctor finally came in the room to go over the results. As the ER doctor pulled up Aron's files on the room's computer, Aron filled him in on his history with Crohn's disease, avascular necrosis, and hip replacements. Aron was so accustomed to recounting his medical history that it now came out like a well-rehearsed presentation. The doctor turned the computer monitor towards Aron and told him that based on the scan, his hip implant had popped out of the socket and shifted into the wrong place. So the dislocated hip would have to be adjusted manually, a procedure the doctor warned would hurt, but only for a moment. The doctor asked Aron if he was ready for the adjustment, and Aron just sort of nodded and said okay. Then a second doctor came in to help with the procedure. Together, these doctors all around the bed forcefully pushed Aron's hip back into place, and true to their word, it was a split second of agonizing pain. But it quickly dissipated, and Aron felt much better. He asked the doctor what was next, and he got a familiar answer. Go back to your orthopedic surgeon for a follow-up. Several days later, Aron sat inside the usual exam room at his orthopedist's office. The doctor examined Aron's CT scans in silence for a minute, and then finally he spoke, and Aron felt his heart sink. The doctor said that even though they had successfully popped the hip back into place, that didn't solve the underlying problem. Aron's left hip implant had become loose because the bone around it was still decaying, and it was now only a matter of time until the same thing happened with his other leg. As a result, his hip implants were now too small to properly fit inside of their sockets. Aron was shocked. How could this have happened? He'd followed all his doctor's instructions for years throughout his multiple recoveries and rehabs. He was very careful with his hips and he stayed away from really strenuous activities. And yet, he'd still dislocated his hip just from getting out of bed. It felt like all the progress he'd made was kind of for nothing. Aron wondered what he could even do at this point to ease his pain. The orthopedic surgeon told Aron that he couldn't really explain why Aron's hips were in such bad shape, but he could tell him what should be done to respond. The only remedy he could suggest for now was to remove the damaged old implants and replace them again with larger ones. Aron left the doctor's office in silence and headed for the parking lot. Then, alone, inside of his car, Aron burst into tears. He just didn't know how much longer he could keep going like this. By the time Aron got home, his despair had morphed into anger. He had already endured 11 serious surgeries and more broken bones than he could count, and he was only 24 years old. He'd seen a parade of doctors, and none of them had come remotely close to figuring out what was actually wrong with him. Even if he got another hip replacement, Aron knew it was only a matter of time until he would have to do it again and again and again if his bones continued to decay. Aron wondered if maybe he would just spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Just then, Emily got home from work, and when Aron saw her, he went from being mad back to being sad all over again, and he broke down and just started crying. Emily tried to comfort him, but Aron was inconsolable. So Emily just kind of let Aron vent, and then once he was done crying and kind of talking about what was going on, she asked him to come keep her company in the kitchen while she made them dinner. Aron smiled at her and then slowly eased himself into a chair at the kitchen table while Emily poured them each some wine. A few minutes later, Aron had calmed down and he was thinking clearly, and he told Emily that too many elements of his medical story just didn't add up. Why would his hip implants fail after 4 years when they were supposed to last 20 years? Why didn't any of the other surgeries work? What was actually going on with his bones? If he was going to subject himself to yet another hip surgery, Aron wanted to make sure he'd exhausted all other options first. But at this point, Aron didn't trust any doctor to figure it out for him. So if he was going to find a solution, he felt like he would need to do it himself. Several weeks later, Aron sat in bed with his laptop resting on his lap. Next to him, Emily was quietly reading a book. Aron had compiled just about all of his medical records dating back to when he was a child, and finally, thanks to his years of studies, he could actually understand what they all meant. When he looked at all of his records together, Aron found patterns that did make sense for a person suffering from Crohn's disease. But so far, nothing he was seeing could explain his weakened bones. Then, all of a sudden, Aron sat up straight with a huge smile on his face. Emily noticed and put her book down and asked what was going on. And he showed her a series of his medical records going back a decade, all indicating severely low levels of an enzyme he'd only heard of once before, called alkaline phosphatase. Back in 2010, when Aron was a junior in high school, one of his doctors had noticed he had low levels of this enzyme, which was why Aron had been tested for the genetic condition called Wilson's disease. Now, Aron did not think much of this at the time, since the results were inconclusive, and no one had ever mentioned the enzyme again. But as Aron dove deeper into his medical records, he noticed the low levels of the enzyme in 2011 as well, and 2012, and 2013. In fact, every year since 2010, his blood tests indicated low levels of alkaline phosphatase. Emily and Aron looked at each other. What was this enzyme, and what did having low levels of it mean? They wondered if maybe it was the key to understanding what was going wrong with Aron's body. Emily looked on hopefully as Aron typed in, "What is alkaline phosphatase?" into an online search engine. The first result he got back was for a website dedicated to an ultra-rare disease with a long name Aron had never heard of. Aron clicked on it, and then immediately after reading just a couple of sentences, he looked at Emily with a big smile on his face. All of his symptoms matched up with what he was reading. Aron had no doubt he had just found what he was looking for. A week later, Aron sat across from his doctor, studying his face as the physician read over the printed out pages Aron had brought for him. The doctor was unfamiliar with this very rare disease that Aron had found online, but he agreed that it did make a lot of sense, and it could be directly caused by the low levels of alkaline phosphatase in his blood. Aron suspected he had a condition called hypophosphatasia. It's an ultra-rare metabolic bone disease that affects the body's ability to make alkaline phosphatase, which helps bones stay healthy by absorbing essential minerals like calcium, phosphate, and magnesium. When there's a deficiency in alkaline phosphatase, the minerals don't get absorbed by the bone. Instead, these minerals collect on tendons, kidneys, and other organs and cause serious damage. In Aron's case, they had collected on his hip bones. Aron's doctor ordered immediate bone scans to test for hypophosphatasia, and a few days later, the bone scans confirmed Aron's theory was right. Miraculously, Aron solved his own lifelong health crisis. In 2018, 1 year after his successful diagnosis, Aron started on enzyme replacement therapy, which is the only treatment known for hypophosphatasia. Aron also had 9 more surgeries to undo damage that had already been done to his body. But since starting the enzyme replacement treatments, Aron's bones have stopped decaying, and calcium deposits in other parts of his body have disappeared completely. As for his Crohn's disease, which actually had nothing to do with his bone condition, that is in remission. But to this day, Aron still does deal with small levels of pain every single day. Aron successfully finished his master's degree and started a family with his wife. Currently, he works as a data and analytics consultant for a hospital system and is a prominent patient advocate for hypophosphatasia.
It was February of 1984, and 25-year-old Terry Brooks had just landed her perfect job. As the young woman with bright blue eyes and shoulder-length blonde hair backed her car out of her parents' driveway and headed west towards the Oxford Valley Mall, she glanced at her watch. Terry had always made a point of being on time, but as the brand new assistant manager of a busy and popular fast food restaurant, she now made a point of arriving a little bit early. Not so early that she got underfoot of the waitstaff or appeared to be that overeager manager who was looking over everybody's shoulders at how they were doing their jobs. But Terry had only been assigned to this Roy Rogers restaurant in Bucks County, Pennsylvania 1 week before, and so she wanted to make sure that she set a positive example as a capable, reliable manager who was friendly, but also very professional. As Terry drove the 13 miles from her parents' neat house in the quiet suburb of Warminster to the busy intersection of Route 1 and Oxford Valley Road in Fairless Hills, she hardly noticed the unusually warm weather, even though it was a surprising and welcome change from eastern Pennsylvania's typical chilly winter afternoons. In fact, Terry's life recently had been so busy and so full of changes and plans that the only remarkable thing about her commute to work was that it offered her a rare 30 minutes of quiet where she could try to organize her thoughts and prepare herself for the 10-hour shift ahead of her. It wasn't the actual work that Terry worried about. She already knew from past experience a lot about what went on inside of a restaurant. Ever since high school and right through the summers that she had spent home from college, Terry had done what most of her friends had also done, gotten summer jobs and part-time jobs as servers at local eateries. But once Terry had graduated from the University of Maryland almost 4 years ago with a degree in personnel management, she had decided to parlay that real-life work experience into a corporate job that would be a step closer to a professional career in the food service industry or in human resources. So, about 7 months earlier, back in July of 1983, Terry had left her longtime job as manager at a local Italian restaurant called Cucci's in her hometown of Warminster
and taken a job with Roy Rogers, a chain of fast food restaurants that was owned by the Marriott Corporation, one of the country's giants in the hospitality industry. Even though the move meant that Terry would be taking an initial pay cut, and that she would start with the Roy Rogers team not as a manager but as an assistant manager, Terry did not for a minute second-guess her decision to leave Coochie's. Because for Terry, taking charge of her life was something that came naturally. When her parents divorced back when Terry was in the 8th grade, the 4 Brooks children had gone to live with their father, George Brooks. Older than her 2 younger sisters and their youngest brother, Terry had immediately taken on more responsibility for her siblings. And even after her father had remarried, Terry was known to her family and friends for her dependability and her unwavering sense of purpose. As Terry's good friend, Cindy Bradney, who was a bartender at Coochie's restaurant, put it, Terry was one of the few people in their circle of friends in Warminster who had gone to college and who had come back home with a plan for going on to bigger and better things. But Terry's good looks and outstanding academic performance, along with her ambition and intelligence, was coupled with such genuine friendliness and kindness that she was more likely to inspire affection and trust than she was to inspire envy. And that was saying a lot, because in the early winter of 1984, it looked like Terry was living the kind of charmed life that everybody wants to have. After finishing college, Terry had made the difficult but very smart decision to end a serious relationship that had become strained and even physically abusive. And when Terry had fallen in love again, almost a year ago, it was with a 22-year-old local man who was a cook at Coochie's, where she used to work. Unlike Terry or her ex-boyfriend, Albert Scott Keefe, who went by his middle name, Scott, had not gone to college. But he was a hard worker, and he appreciated that combination of warmth and competence that made Terry really stand out from the crowd. Turning her attention away from the road just for a moment, Terry glanced down at the engagement ring on her left hand. She and Scott had known within weeks of meeting each other at Coochie's that their mutual attraction would lead to more than just a casual workplace romance. And sure enough, 3 months later, Scott had asked Terry to marry him, and with a radiant smile, Terry had said yes. Since then, the couple had been busy working and saving money for their upcoming wedding, which was planned for July 14th. With Scott living at his mom's house just 3 miles from where Terry was living with her parents, the two of them had just decided the week before that they could afford to put money down on a 10-day honeymoon to Hawaii. The moment the two of them had walked into the travel agency in nearby Doylestown, Pennsylvania 3 days ago, it had been both exciting and nerve-wracking. For Terry, the sight of the brochures that described Hawaii's sandy beaches, rugged coastlines, waterfalls, rainforests, and volcanoes suddenly made both the honeymoon and the wedding seem not only very real, but also very close. As Terry passed by the shops and strip malls and slices of farmland and cornfields that stretched out along either side of Route 132 East, she suddenly felt overwhelmed. There was so much to do and plan over the next 5.5 weeks, starting with the shopping trip she and her stepmother would make tomorrow to see if they could find a wedding gown for Terry. For Scott, Terry's career change also meant a few adjustments. Mostly that Terry's new job with Roy Rogers meant that they would no longer see each other every day at Coochie's, where they both used to work. But Terry and her family had appreciated the effort Scott made to check in on her now that she was working the night shift at a restaurant much further away from her home in Warminster. Although the Fairless Hills Roy Rogers was not located in a high-crime area, the clientele and overall vibe of the restaurant were very different from that of Coochie's. Instead of a local customer base and quiet location, Terry's Roy Rogers was stationed right at the intersection of 2 heavily used major roadways. By design, the fast food restaurant, with its Western theme and signature roast beef sandwiches, was a brightly lit, glass-sided cube of warmth and invitation that was intended to entice an endless stream of hungry travelers, many of whom would never return. But so far, any trouble that Terry had experienced at work had not come from customers. Instead, it had come from Roy Rogers' staff. 2 months earlier, while training at a different Roy Rogers, Terry had had a very nasty confrontation with an employee who outright refused to follow a simple order she had given him. Instead, Steve Daly blew up at her, called her terrible names, and became physically aggressive.
Management had immediately fired this guy, but for a while, he still came back to the restaurant as a customer and sat glowering at Terry and her staff from one of the tables. More recently, at the Roy Rogers in Fairless Hills, her Roy Rogers, as she liked to remind herself, there had been an issue with one of the cash registers coming up $40 short at the end of a shift. Terry had had her suspicions about an employee named Barb who worked at her location, but soon after Terry had confronted her staff, the missing money had turned up, returned to the safe in an unmarked envelope. So it was probably no wonder, Terry thought to herself as she approached the intersection of North Oxford Road and US Route 1, that Scott was concerned about her safety and often came to sit in the restaurant after closing to make sure she and any other late-night staff were not left there alone. Seeing the Roy Rogers sign in the distance, Terry reminded herself to call Scott later that evening and tell him that she'd be later than usual that night since she had to catch up on some important paperwork. As Terry turned on her car blinker and prepared to enter the Roy Rogers parking lot, she also made a mental note to let Scott know that she'd be fine. There was no need for him to come by and sit with her. It was Friday, February 3rd, and Terry knew Scott had an early shift the next morning, and there would be 2 teenagers staying there with her in the restaurant cleaning until about 1:30 a.m. So Scott didn't need to worry. Terry would not be alone. A minute later, and Terry had parked the car and turned off the engine. As she gathered her brown purse and slipped her car keys into the pocket of her light purple jacket, she glanced at herself in the rearview mirror. Straightening the collar of her Roy Rogers maroon dress shirt, Terry felt a thrill of accomplishment and hope. She'd only been working for the Marriott Corporation less than a year, but already Terry had learned so much about running a business and being a supervisor. And even the recent challenges had given her a chance to apply some of what she had learned in college about personnel management. And those conflicts had also been good practice on how to stand up for herself and be authoritative when it came to expressing expectations and consequences. A few minutes later, her blonde hair glowing under the light spilling out of the big glass windows of the wood-framed restaurant, Terry stepped up to the outer door leading into her Roy Rogers. At 6:45 a.m. the next morning, Saturday, February 4th, 1984, Scott was passing by Terry's parents' house on his way to work when he noticed that Terry's car was not parked in its usual spot in the Brooks' driveway. Puzzled, Scott slowed down. At 10 p.m. the night before, Terry had called him to say she'd be working late. Terry had been very busy, so their conversation was short, but Scott was sure he remembered every word correctly. "Honey, don't worry about me," Terry had told him. "I have some paperwork to finish tonight, but there are 2 other people that will be here with me." Coming to a sudden decision, Scott pulled his truck up to the curb. Despite the early hour, he decided to check in with Terry's parents just to make sure Terry had made it home okay the night before. Hopping out of his truck and heading for the front door of the house, Scott glanced at his watch. He was probably worrying for no reason, and he'd be back on the road in just a minute. And besides, even with the unplanned stop he was making, he'd still have enough time before his shift even started to enjoy a cigarette and a cup of coffee once he arrived at work. But a few minutes later, Scott was sitting down inside the Brooks kitchen, staring at Terry's parents with a stunned look on his face. Both Elizabeth and George Brooks had just checked Terry's bedroom and found that it was empty. The bed was made, and there was no sign anywhere in the house of their oldest daughter. As Terry's 51-year-old father stepped to the kitchen phone and dialed the number of the Fairless Hills Roy Rogers restaurant 30 minutes away, Scott pushed himself slowly to his feet, and he and Terry's mother, Elizabeth, leaned forward, straining to hear the voice on the other end of the line. The call was answered by a police officer. 1 hour earlier, at about 6 a.m., the manager of the Fairless Hills, Roy Rogers, had arrived, as he always did on Saturday mornings, to open up the restaurant and get things ready for the breakfast shift. It wasn't until Joseph Hampton reached the front door and found it unlocked that he had the first inkling that something might be wrong. There was a second inner door to the restaurant that stayed open during business hours, but locked automatically when staff closed it behind them and left for the night. But this outer door had to be locked using a key, and obviously someone had failed to do that. Suddenly alert, the manager stepped inside, unlocked the second door, and turned to look at the tables and booths in the dining area.
Seeing that nothing appeared to be out of order, he relaxed slightly as he stepped behind the counter with its bank of cash registers into the small rectangular prep area in the entryway to the kitchen. That's when he stopped. In a faint glow of light shining out from the partially closed office door ahead of him, the manager could just make out the shape of a human body. Terry Brooks lay on her back on the red-tiled floor. Dressed in her short purple winter coat, her purse and keys and shoes were all scattered in the space around her. Standing there in the semi-darkness, it took Joseph a moment to recognize who she was, because Terry's head was completely wrapped in one of the big plastic bags that should have been lining the nearby trash can, and just below the bag, there was the wooden handle of a butcher knife sticking out of Terry's throat. Within minutes of receiving Joseph's frantic 911 call at 6:12 a.m., the first officers and emergency medical personnel from the Falls Township Police Department were rolling into the Roy Rogers parking lot, lights flashing and officers already preparing to close off the perimeter of the restaurant with yellow crime scene tape. When Terry's father called Roy Rogers' restaurant that morning at about 7 a.m., his wife Elizabeth would later remember every word of the short exchange. "This is George Brooks, Terry Brooks' father. Terry didn't come home last night. Is she okay?" George's wife and Terry's fiancé did not have to strain to hear the police officer's answer. No, she's not. She's been murdered. It did not take the lead detectives on the case very long to form a theory of what had happened inside the Fairless Hills Roy Rogers restaurant in the early hours of Saturday, February 4th. Because not only was Terry Brooks dead with no sign that she had been sexually assaulted, but also the store safe had been left wide open and more than $2,700 was missing. To detectives George Mitchell and Tim Stefan, that and everything else about the scene and the likely time of the murder pointed to a robbery homicide. According to early interviews with restaurant staff, Terry had sent two teenagers who had given the restaurant its final cleaning home at about 1:30 a.m. And even though restaurant protocol required a minimum of 2 staff in the restaurant at closing, Terry had decided to stay a little longer by herself to finish her paperwork. Then, dressed to leave work in her coat with her purse and keys in hand, police theorized that Terry's attacker may have waited for her outside and gained entry to the safe and money by pushing Terry back inside the restaurant as she was leaving. If Terry had fought back, the robber may have panicked and killed her. Police also considered the possibility that someone had entered the restaurant before it closed and had hidden somewhere inside with the intent of robbing the safe. In either scenario, robbery and money were the primary motives, and Terry, tragically, was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it wasn't just the crime scene that suggested this had been a robbery gone wrong, it was this particular robbery against a backdrop of other recent robberies in the same region. During the last several months, law enforcement in and around Bucks County, Pennsylvania, had received so many reports of restaurants being burglarized that police and the media had nicknamed the perpetrator or perpetrators the Freezer Bandits. But given the brutality of Terry's murder, police also considered the possibility that there was a personal element to the crime, and that one of Terry's co-workers was the robber, and they had disliked her enough that, finding her inside the restaurant, they decided to kill her. Even as crime scene techs were busy gathering physical evidence at Roy Rogers, and the deputy coroner was collecting evidence from Terry's body, police investigators were at the Brooks residence out in Warminster taking statements from Scott and Terry's parents. Since the majority of homicides are committed by a spouse or partner, Scott was an obvious person of interest. But there was nothing in Scott's story or in statements from Terry's friends and family that suggested he had a motive or connection to the crime. Terry's mother confirmed that her daughter had called Scott at about 10 p.m. the night before to say she was working late and he didn't need to stop by, and according to Elizabeth, there was nothing to indicate that the couple had quarreled or that the phone conversation was anything other than affectionate. And there was nothing in the couple's recent behavior that suggested trouble. Just 3 days earlier, Scott and Terry had paid for their honeymoon to Hawaii, and on the day of her murder, Terry and her stepmom had been looking forward to going shopping together for Terry's wedding gown. Where police did see red flags was in the description they heard from family and friends about Terry's relationship with her ex-boyfriend.
And at the same time that investigators were tracking down that lead and corroborating the statements of Scott and Terry's family and friends, detectives interviewing Terry's coworkers quickly learned about Terry's confrontation 2 months ago with Steve Daly that had led to him being fired. And they also heard about the more recent incident involving the $40 missing from one of the Roy Rogers cash registers. But it wasn't long before Township Falls investigators, pursuing all of these various leads, began running into one dead end after another. In quick succession, they eliminated Terry's old boyfriend, as well as Steve Daly, from the suspect list. The ex-boyfriend had moved to California and had an airtight alibi. As for Steve Daly, he also had an alibi, and he passed a lie detector test. Another Roy Rogers employee, whose fingerprints were found on the sill of the drive-through window that Terry's attacker had almost certainly used as an escape route, as well as on the plastic bag that was wrapped around Terry's head, also passed a lie detector test. And in addition to having an alibi, the presence of that employee's fingerprints was explained by the fact that he had worked at the drive-through window and that he had also placed the bag wrapped around Terry's head into the trash can, from which the bag had later been removed. It wasn't until late February and early March that the investigation suddenly regained momentum. That's when 2 more female workers at fast food restaurants within a 100-mile radius of Fairless Hills were attacked in separate incidents. Both crimes appeared to be robberies, and at one of the restaurants, the young woman was stabbed to death. But the man arrested for that murder turned out to have no connection to Terry's death. And by the end of March, police had also captured the so-called freezer bandits and determined that they too had no connection to Terry's death. By July 14, 1984, the date set for Terry and Scott to get married, the investigation into the murder of Terry Brooks had gone cold. Despite a $5,000 reward from the Marriott Corporation for information that would lead to the arrest of Terry's murderer, and despite asking for help from law enforcement in other states, as well as from the FBI, and at the request of Terry's family, even consulting 3 psychics, the Falls Township Police Department had run out of leads, suspects, and the resources necessary to continue the investigation. Over the next 10 years, Terry's family suffered. George Brooks's hair turned white, his cheeks lost their fullness, and his smile, so like his daughter Terry's, rarely appeared on his face. George had bought Scott a new suit to wear to Terry's funeral, which was held on February 8, 1984, when there was still so many leads in the investigation into Terry's murder that police were practically working around the clock. But after that service, as the investigation stalled, the Brooks family lost touch with Scott. And a decade later, Scott would eventually marry and go on to have a child. With Terry's 3 siblings to take care of, George and Elizabeth Brooks also did their best to move forward. But they never stopped checking in with investigators to see if there was any new information about their daughter's murder. Finally, in 1990, the Brooks hired a lawyer to file a wrongful death lawsuit against the Marriott Corporation. This kind of lawsuit seeks compensation for the emotional loss of a victim's family or survivors, like lost companionship. And these kinds of lawsuits are also very hard to win. But for the Brooks, the purpose of this lawsuit was not to get money. It was to get investigators for both sides to do their own digging into Terry's murder to see if the wrongful death claim had any legal merit. In 1990, investigators for the Brooks attorney handed their report over to local law enforcement, and at some point, that report was added to the stack of documents marked Terry Brooks that sat gathering dust in the Township Falls Police Storage Unit. But on May 22, 1998, 14 years after Terry's body had been discovered on the floor in the Fairless Hills Roy Rogers restaurant, the investigation into her murder was back in the media spotlight. The day before, on the 3rd Thursday of the month, 82 well-dressed men and women could all be seen climbing the stone steps of a large Victorian brownstone located in the heart of downtown Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Each person entering the Old City Tavern wore a distinctive red, white, and blue rosette pinned to their chest.
and each one was a member of a very select group of crime investigators who were well known in law enforcement circles, but unknown to the general public. This was a regular meeting of the VDUC Society, a unique crime-fighting organization co-founded 8 years earlier by 3 nationally recognized forensic investigators. Named after Eugene Vidocq, a French detective who is considered the father of modern crime investigation, its members select and review cold cases brought to them by law enforcement agencies, offering fresh perspectives that might help kickstart a stalled investigation. On the agenda for that cool and cloudy Thursday afternoon was a 1-hour slideshow by Falls Township Police Sergeant Wynn Cloud that would present all the evidence police had gathered during their failed 1984 investigation into the death of 25-year-old Terry Brooks. Sergeant Cloud had recently been promoted by the township's new police chief to head up the department's detective division. At the same time, Chief Arnie Connelline had also ordered Sergeant Cloud to start reviewing cold cases, and the first case on that list was Terry Brooks. So, after the VDUC Society members, one for every 82 years of Eugene Vidocq's life, had finished their formal lunch and were waiting for dessert, a very nervous Detective Cloud stepped up to the podium at the front of the grand dining room, a slide projector on the table next to him, and a large silver projection screen behind him. And over the next 60 minutes, VDUC Society investigators saw images of the 90 pieces of physical evidence and pictures that had been collected from the Fairless Hills Roy Rogers, where Terry had been killed. The slides included fingerprints, Terry's bloodied purple jacket, the butcher knife sticking out of her throat, the contents of her purse scattered across the floor around her, the defensive wounds on Terry's hands and arms, the drive-through window where the murderer had fled the scene of the crime, and a picture of the blood and tissue, assumed to be that of her attacker, that had been scraped from underneath Terry's fingernails. Back in 1984, when Terry was killed, an examination of that blood and tissue would not have revealed the identity of the killer. But since then, a lot had changed in forensic science. And now, in 1998, if police could find a suspect whose DNA profile matched a DNA analysis of those samples, police would have the breakthrough on this case that they needed. But first, they needed to find that suspect. When the presentation was over, members of the VDUC Society had harsh words for the original team that investigated Terry's murder. It wasn't that the detectives back in 1984 weren't working night and day to solve a case that had produced enough statements to fill 3 large cardboard boxes. The problem, according to forensic psychologist Richard Walter, was that investigators had misinterpreted the crime scene. Instead of focusing on the robbery angle, right from the start, detectives should have been focusing on the extreme violence of the murder itself. Putting down his fork and pushing aside his plate of thick-crusted apple pie, one of the 3 founders of the VDUC Society went on to tell Sergeant Cloud that even though the case was 14 years old, the murder itself had already revealed a great deal of information about the killer. But police would need to begin the whole investigation over from scratch, starting with a DNA analysis of the tissue sample collected from under Terry's fingernails. And then Dr. Walters told police the 2 key questions that would lead them to discover the identity of Terry's murderer. Over the next 4 months, 32-year-old Falls Township detective Nelson Whitney took the lead on the new investigation into the Terry Brooks homicide, ordering a complete DNA analysis of blood, hair, and tissue samples found at the crime scene. Then, with the help of the VDUC Society and a profile of the killer developed by Richard Walter, investigators re-interviewed Terry's parents, former co-workers, and friends of Terry who had not been interviewed during the first investigation. Investigators also combed through the funeral register that listed the names of people who had attended Terry's memorial service back on February 8, 1984, trying to track down the phone numbers and addresses of possible witnesses or suspects. And then, buried in the old files, Detective Whitney discovered the report that had been done 8 years earlier by the investigators who had been hired to look into the wrongful death lawsuit Terry's parents had filed back in 1990.
That report, along with an interview with Terry's friend, Sydney Bradney, the bartender at Coochie's restaurant where Terry and she had worked before Terry took the job at Roy Rogers, eventually led investigators to the suspect they'd been looking for. The challenge now was how to link this person to the crime and get a written confession. 1 month later, early one morning in October of 1998, Detective Nelson sat in an unmarked police car staking out a modest home that had become as familiar to him as his own house. It was trash day, and Detective Whitney had already seen the residents of this particular house put their bag of trash out at the curb. The detective also knew that the moment they dropped it there by the street, whatever was inside that bag was no longer considered their own private property. Instead, anyone who wanted to rummage around in that trash or take something out of the trash and keep it was legally free to do so. The investigator tensed when he heard the rumble of the garbage collection truck coming down the road behind him. Watching the truck in his rearview mirror, the young detective put his hand on the inside handle of the driver's side car door. And as soon as the garbage truck slowed to a stop and one of the workers hopped down and picked up that bag of trash in front of the house that Detective Whitney had been watching, the detective was out of his car and across the street. By prior arrangement with the garbage collection company, the detective took the bag directly from the gloved hand of the sanitation worker, carried it back to his car, tossed it into the trunk, jumped inside the car, and drove off to the Falls Township Police Station. With any luck, that bag of trash would contain a DNA sample from their suspect that would line up with the DNA of the tissue collected 14 years earlier from Terry's dead body. And sure enough, a smear of saliva scraped off the butt of one of the discarded cigarettes inside that trash bag would turn out to be a solid match. And on the evening of February 4th, 1998, on the 14th anniversary of Terry's murder, police knocked on the door of the house where the suspect lived. Based on the new information police had learned from Terry's friend, Cindy, coupled with the information the police would learn directly from the suspect over the course of the next 6 hours, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Terry Brooks in the early morning hours of that Saturday 14 years ago, in the minutes just before she left work at her Roy Rogers restaurant in Fairless Hills. As Terry drove to work on the evening of Friday, February 3rd, 1984, she thought about her conversation the week before with her good friend Cindy. At the time they had talked, Terry had been so distressed that she practically broke down in tears. But now, a few days later, while Terry still felt upset, she also felt like she knew what she had to do to make things right. It wouldn't be easy, but as Terry was learning very quickly, she just needed to accept that other people were not always going to agree with or welcome every decision she made. By the time Terry had pulled into the parking lot of the Fairless Hills Roy Rogers, she told herself it was time to stop worrying and turn her attention instead to the work shift ahead of her. A few minutes later, and Terry was stepping out of the foggy darkness into the brightly lit and cheerful interior of the restaurant. And after that, Terry didn't have time to worry even if she wanted to, because the next 8 hours flew by. First in a rush of food orders and the clatter of plates and silverware, and then, after the restaurant closed to the public, in the bustle of staff cleaning up and getting ready to leave for the night. By the time Terry had locked the glass doors behind the two-person cleaning crew that left at 1:30 a.m., she had almost finished with her paperwork. And a half hour after that, and Terry was more than ready to go home. It had been a long day and night, and she was looking forward to sleeping late that morning. Pulling on her short winter jacket and reaching for her brown purse, Terry glanced around the office to make sure everything was in its place for the next day. But just when Terry was about to turn out the office light and leave, she stopped, sure that she had just heard a knock on the front door of the restaurant. Slipping her purse over her shoulder and gripping her set of keys in her free hand, Terry stepped through the kitchen prep area so she could peek out into the parking lot. Recognizing the person standing outside, Terry relaxed, but only slightly. Letting out a deep breath, she walked forward to open the doors for her unexpected visitor. Half an hour earlier, when the two-person cleaning crew had left Roy Rogers,
Terry's killer had already been watching the restaurant from the parking lot next door for 30 minutes. Even without the car engine and heater running, the night was so unseasonably warm that inside of the car was still comfortable. Not that the killer would have noticed anyway. There were more important things to think about, like how Terry deserved everything that she had coming to her. Seeing her lock the door behind the two teenagers and disappear back into the dimly lit kitchen area, the killer reached over to the pack of Newports lying on the passenger seat. There was just enough time for one more cigarette. At 2 a.m., the killer had left their vehicle and was knocking on the front door of Roy Rogers. A few minutes later, the killer had followed Terry towards the back of the restaurant until they were both standing on the red-tiled floor just outside of the kitchen. Only now, the two of them weren't just talking, they were arguing. And this time, Terry was not backing down. And in response to what Terry had to say, Terry's killer suddenly stepped forward and hit Terry in the face. The blow was so hard, it literally lifted Terry out of her moccasin-style shoes and sent her flying. She landed flat on her back, her keys and the contents of her purse skittering off in every direction. And that was just the beginning. Once Terry was on the floor, her attacker straddled her body and began choking her and pounding her head against the floor. Then, the killer reached up to grab a 7-inch long butcher knife from one of the tables above them. The autopsy report later showed that Terry would suffer not one, but several fatal injuries. In addition to brain hemorrhage, a broken bone in her throat, and a crushed voice box, Terry would be stabbed 20 times in the face, neck, and torso, as well as beaten with a length of lead pipe. But even as she was dying, Terry fought back. After her attacker had stabbed the knife once through her neck, Terry threw her hands and arms up to protect herself, and in doing that, her fingernails dragged along the surface of the attacker's skin. It wasn't until the second knife strike severed Terry's spinal cord and left her paralyzed that she finally lay still, her arms falling outstretched to either side of her body. The tip of the knife had dug so deeply into the floor that Terry's throat was pinned to the hard red tiles. Unable to scream or move, Terry stared up into the face of her killer. Still, it wasn't over. Breathing heavily with excitement, Terry's killer got up off the floor and, stepping to the nearby trash can, pulled out the clear plastic bag that lined the bin. Returning to where Terry lay trapped, her killer bent down and wrapped the bag around her head, and then watched as Terry's final breaths created a film of condensation inside the suffocating layers of plastic. A minute later, the killer had turned away, cracked open the door of the safe, and gathered up all the bills inside. Then, with a last look around, the killer pushed open the drive-through window, climbed over the sill, and dropped down onto the pavement below before running at a crouch back to the adjacent parking lot. There was the sound of a car engine starting, and then the killer was turning out onto Route 1 to head home. 14 years later, these two questions that forensic psychologist Richard Walter asked at the May 21st meeting of the VDUC Society would in fact lead police straight to Terry's killer. The first question was, who would Terry trust and know well enough to let into the restaurant at 2 a.m. the morning she died? And the second question was, who had such intense feelings for Terry that their attack would have been brutal enough to kill her several times over? There was only one answer: Terry's devoted fiancé, Albert Scott Keefe. It would turn out that when police reopened the investigation into Terry's death, Terry's friend, Cindy Bradney, would tell investigators that just the week before Terry was killed, Terry had confided that she was thinking of calling off her July 14th wedding. 8 months into her engagement, Terry had begun to have serious second thoughts about spending her life with Scott. It turned out he had a bad temper, and he was jealous and very possessive of Terry. Terry had begun to feel that the real reason he came to sit with her at Roy Rogers while she closed the restaurant had less to do with concern over her safety and more to do with ungrounded suspicions that she might be seeing other people. Scott also had money problems, and so he was angry when Terry left Coochie's restaurant, where they both worked, for a lower-paying job at Roy Rogers.
When Terry had walked into the Doylestown travel agency with Scott 3 days before she was killed and paid for the couple's honeymoon, Terry may have realized that the time had come to end her engagement or delay the wedding before it was too late. And according to Dr. Walter and other Viaduct Society members who would later review the investigation into Terry's murder, the safe at Roy Rogers may have been robbed, but the real motive for Terry's death had never been money. Instead, this had been a complex and personal murder committed by someone driven by both anger and retaliation. Someone who would rather kill Terry many times over than allow her to walk away from their relationship. Everything else about the crime, the robbery, jumping out of the drive-thru window, Scott appearing later that morning at the Brooks' house full of concern over not seeing Terry's car in the driveway, all of that had been pure misdirection. But now, 14 years later, on February 4th, 1998, armed with the DNA from one of Scott's discarded Newport cigarette butts that was tied to the hair and tissue found at the crime scene, investigators finally had the physical evidence they needed to bring Scott into the police station for questioning. By then, Scott and his wife were divorced, and Scott's life seemed to have come full circle. He was once again living with his mother in Warminster and working at an Italian pizzeria the next town over. Confronted with the new DNA evidence, new witness statements that described serious tensions in Scott's relationship with Terry, and the fact that he had failed a lie detector test, in the early hours of February 5th, 1998, Scott confessed to the murder of Terry Brooks. In a final twist to a case that had now captured national attention, police also revealed that the report filed by investigators looking into the wrongful death lawsuit the Brooks had filed back in 1990 had also listed Scott Keefe as the most likely person to have murdered Terry. The report also included the witness statement that placed Scott in the parking lot adjacent to Roy Rogers about an hour before Terry was killed. Almost 2 years later, on Monday, June 5th, 2000, 37-year-old Scott Keefe was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Terry's father, George Brooks, died before Scott's trial, succumbing to a long illness just 15 months after he was informed that Scott had been arrested for killing his daughter. In February of 2000, 4 months before Scott's trial, Terry's family won its wrongful death lawsuit against Marriott Corporation. The $675,000 settlement was divided between attorneys and Terry's estate. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia lies this thick green jungle. And if you know where to look, there is actually a walking path that leads you from Amaga deep into this jungle, and if you keep going, it will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. Now, this bridge is no longer used by trains, it's been decommissioned. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge, although it is the foot traffic variety. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people will leap off of high places, like this bridge, and they'll jump with an elastic rope tied to their ankles. And so this rope has been very carefully measured so that when it is fully stretched all the way out, it ensures whoever has jumped will still not impact the ground. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Amaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yenia had talked about for a long time, wanting to go bungee jumping, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he capitalized on the opportunity because he had never bungee jumped before and he really wanted to, but he couldn't without his girlfriend. And so now it seemed like she was serious. And so right away, he called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Amaga. And when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge.
And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who are already in line on this bridge waiting to jump off of it. They knew this was a popular spot, but perhaps they didn't realize just how popular it was. And so Yenia and her boyfriend, they get in line behind the nearly 100 other jumpers ahead of them, and they proceed to wait. And over the next several hours, Yenia and her boyfriend would have front row seats to all of the jumpers ahead of them jumping off the bridge. Now, it seems like Yenia, in her mind, believed she would arrive at this bridge and very quickly she and her boyfriend would leap off and it would be great and so much fun. But now they've been forced to wait for a really long time. And this whole time, they're watching other people jump. And Yenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do. And so she was beginning to second guess her decision. And so her boyfriend, he's trying to calm her down and he's telling her, oh, it's totally safe. Look at all these people who have jumped. They're all fine. They're all smiling. They're so happy. You're going to be so proud of yourself. But despite his best efforts to calm his girlfriend down, Yenia just could not calm down. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's going to go through with this. So several hours went by of this totally high-stress, anxious waiting period, and then finally, Yenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, at which point the staff members who've been doing this all day long, they signal the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so Yenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform, so they're looking out over this ravine, and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And the whole time, Yenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision, her heart is racing, she's totally panicked. She doesn't think this is fun at all. She just wants to get this over with. And then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, okay, jump. And so Yenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, okay, jump, was talking to her boyfriend, not Yenia. However, Yenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge, he leapt over the railing, and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down. Which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. Our next story is called Geocaching.
On May 2nd, 2000, at approximately midnight Eastern Standard Time, the US government discontinued its use of selective availability. Selective availability was the intentional degradation of public GPS signals. It guaranteed that civilian GPS users would not be able to pinpoint locations on a map using their GPS. They could get to within maybe 50 to 100 meters, but that was the best they could do. Prior to the year 2000, there was some concern that if you gave the general public the ability to use GPS to precisely locate things on a map, that presented an elevated national security risk. But that line of thinking became antiquated, and so on May 2nd, just after midnight, the so-called Great Blue Switch, as GPS enthusiasts refer to it, was flipped, and instantly tens of thousands of GPS receivers received this incredible upgrade. People who were following this development were eager to test out this new capability. And one such GPS enthusiast, a guy named Dave Ulmer who lived in Oregon, decided he wanted to create a sort of GPS treasure hunt. So he got this box, and inside of it he put a notebook and a pen, and he brought it out to the middle of the woods in Oregon, and he got the precise GPS coordinates of where he put it. And he took those coordinates and he went to an online forum and he posted the coordinates and he said, Go to these coordinates, and when you get there, if you find what you're looking for, there'll be a notebook. Record yourself in the notebook, and I'll be out there to check who's done this, and if your name's in there, I'll give you credit on this forum. And so this treasure hunt went viral, and lots of people all over the world thought it was a really cool idea to use this new GPS technology to create treasure hunts all over the world. So people started hiding not just treasure chests with notebooks, but all sorts of random things all over the world, and then posting their coordinates online for people to find. This activity was given a name, geocaching, and it's alive and well today, and it's streamlined on the official geocaching app. But as geocaching has evolved over the years, so too has the level of difficulty at finding some of these caches. Sometimes it requires geocachers to climb mountains, other times it requires them to dive underwater, and in one case, geocachers in the Czech Republic had to climb into this strictly off-limits 5-kilometer long underground tunnel where the only two entry points were on the two extreme ends, and to get to the geocache, you had to go to the middle of the tunnel. And of course, periodically, this tunnel completely floods. On June 9th, 2018, 4 geocachers in the Czech Republic decided, you know what, we're going to go down into that tunnel and we're going to get that geocache. So they made their way over to the Metulski Brook Tunnel, which was one of the 2 entry points, and they climbed down inside. The reason this tunnel periodically floods is because rainwater gets dumped in there, and the second entry point is literally sitting in a lake. There is literally water sitting right up against the lip of this entry point. So even light rain will get the lake to rise just enough to where all the lake water pours into this tunnel. And so the day these 4 geocachers are going into this tunnel, the weather forecast called for torrential downpours, flash flooding, and either these 4 geocachers were not paying attention to the weather, or they somehow thought this wouldn't affect their ability to get this geocache. So these geocachers get down into the tunnel and they start making their way towards the center to collect their prize when outside it starts pouring rain. It rained so much, so fast that the lake entrance started dumping tens of thousands of gallons of water in on one side, and then on the other side, where this other entrance was at the bottom of a hill, you had all this water rushing in. So it was like 2 huge waves of water crashing in on them. And in fact, the survivors would say, because they were right towards the middle of the tunnel, they heard what sounded like a car was getting closer and closer and closer. And that's when they realized it was 2 waves of water crashing in on them. In a panic, they turned and started running back towards the entrance they came in on, but as they're running, they're hit with this wave, and 2 of the geocachers got sucked underneath, and the other 2 were pushed up and were basically body surfing their way towards the lake entrance. And so as they're moving forward, the wave from the lake comes in and hits them, and now the water is dangerously close to the ceiling, and the 2 that have been pushed towards the lake entrance, they don't know what's happened to the other 2, but they're just swimming as fast as they can towards the lake entrance. And they swam almost 2 kilometers in this tunnel as the water got higher and higher and higher, and they're barely able to breathe by the end. They only had about a couple inches of clearance by the time they got to the lake, and they finally pop out and they get in the lake. And then luckily there was someone that saw them and brought their boat over and picked them up. As for their 2 friends, unfortunately, they didn't get out of there in time and they both drowned.
Our next story is called 127 Hours.
While he was in college at Carnegie Mellon University, Aron Ralston studied mechanical engineering, French, and piano, and then upon graduation, he moved to the Southwest and took a job as an engineer. But 5 years into his corporate job, he realized he hated it, and so he quit and moved to Colorado to pursue his real passion in life, which was mountain climbing. On April 25th, 2003, Ralston takes a trip to Utah where he plans to explore the Canyonlands National Park. He slept in his truck that night, and the next morning at about 9:15 a.m. he gets up, and it's this beautiful Saturday morning. He hops on his bike, and he bikes 15 miles to Blue John Canyon. The canyon was an 11-mile gorge that at certain places was as narrow as 3 feet across. And so Aron locks up his bike and he begins walking through this canyon. About 6 hours later at 2:45 p.m., Aron is right at this section of the gorge that's getting really, really narrow, and below him is about 100 feet down to the bottom of the desert floor. He was going to walk with both feet on either wall because it was so narrow and kind of Spider-Man his way through this section of the canyon. But as he began that maneuver, a huge 800-pound boulder became dislodged above him, and it comes tumbling down, and he barely gets out of the way, but it lands on his arm, and it pins his arm against the wall, and he can't move, and he's suspended 100 feet off the ground, and he's 20 miles away from the nearest paved road. Immediately, he tries to pull his hand free and push the rock off, but it's not going anywhere. And that's when it dawns on him that he didn't tell anybody he was going to be in this gorge today. No one knows he's here, and he's so far away from anyone that can help him, and he doesn't have a cell phone, he doesn't have a radio, he's got no way to communicate with anyone who could potentially help him. Now, the position he was in was not him dangling by his arm 100 feet off the ground. He was able to position himself against the rocks where he wasn't dangling. He was able to sit fairly comfortably besides his arm being crushed, and he was able to use the rock that actually had pinned him there as a sort of table or something to lean up against. And after he calms down a little bit, after a few minutes, he reaches back and he pulls his bag out in front and he starts taking inventory of what he has. And all he had was 12 ounces of water, so just a single water bottle, and he had 2 burritos and some candy bar crumbs. That was all he had. In terms of tools, all he had was this crummy multi-tool. And it did have a little knife that extended off the end, and almost immediately he takes that multi-tool and begins chopping away at this boulder to try to see if he can maybe crack it and push half of it off. But he's finding out very quickly that it's completely futile. It is not moving. It is an enormous boulder. It's not going anywhere. He cannot possibly break it with this crappy little multi-tool. As the sun began to set, Aron started thinking really seriously about trying to cut his arm off. But again, all he has is this multi-tool and this crappy little dull knife, and he's thinking there's no way I can cut through my arm. There's bone in there. I can't possibly saw through the bone. And so very disheartened, he puts his multi-tool away and he begins to nurse the water and slowly eat the food and thinks maybe some miracle will happen where over the next couple of days, someone will be within earshot, I can yell to them and they can come get me, or maybe someone will see me when they're hiking overhead. I can just wait it out. But by the 5th day, he had run out of water, he was becoming delirious, he was actually drinking his own urine at this point, and he expected to die overnight. And so with his multi-tool, he etched his name into the rock, and then underneath it he etched the date he expected to die, which was the next day. And then after that, he put his multi-tool down, and he did have a camera with limited battery, and he pulled that out, and selfie style, he filmed goodbyes to his family.
My name's Aron Ralston. My parents are Donald and Larry Ralston of Englewood, Colorado. Whoever finds this, please make an attempt to get it to them. Be sure of it. I would appreciate it.
After he was done filming, he put the camera away and he leaned up against the rock and fully expected to die. But he starts to have this really intense dream where he sees himself playing with a child and he's missing his right arm. And he takes that as a sign that he's supposed to chop his arm off and get out of here alive and go start a family. And so he wakes up from this dream and suddenly all he wants to do is survive. And he looks at his arm, which is already starting to decompose at this point, and he thinks to himself, I know I can't cut through bone, but what if I'm able to break my arm clean through? I can take this blade and cut through the break in the bone. And so he began testing using the edge of the rock as a fulcrum to see if he'd be able to break his arm, using the torque of pushing it over the edge of the rock. And when he started to sense it was possible, he took a deep breath, and then he broke his arm, takes his multi-tool, and over the next hour, he would painstakingly saw through his entire arm. Once his arm was free, he couldn't believe it. He actually smiled when he saw his arm still pinned underneath the rock because of his sheer will to live at this point. And high on adrenaline, he climbed these 65 feet out of this canyon with his one arm. He gets to the trail and he runs 6 miles, and he happens to run into a group of hikers. They give him food and water and they're totally alarmed by him, but they're happy to help him. They call 911 and medics arrive and they save Aron's life. Following Aron Ralston's rescue, they went back to retrieve his arm, But in order to move that boulder, they had to bring out 13 park rangers, a hydraulic jack, and a winch, and all this heavy equipment, and they were barely able to move it. And they told Aron, had you still been in place, there's no way we could have placed the equipment without killing you. So basically, you had to cut your arm off in order to get out of there. There was no other way out. And so for Aron, I'm sure that felt pretty good to feel like you cut your arm off and that was the right decision. They would take his arm and they would cremate it and give the ashes to Aron. And Aron, after having his cremated arm for a couple of days, decided, no, I need to put this where it belongs. And so Aron went back out to the canyon where he had been trapped and he scattered his ashes over the boulder that had nearly killed him. In 2010, Aron's ordeal was turned into a huge blockbuster movie called 127 Hours, where James Franco plays Aron Ralston in the movie, and it's an incredible movie, albeit it's pretty hard to watch. Aron Ralston himself said the movie, although it's a drama, is pretty much a documentary because James Franco does an incredible job portraying his emotions and what it was actually like to be trapped underneath this boulder for 5 days.
The fourth and final story of today's episode is called Headcount. At around 2 p.m. on September 24th, 2017, a 17-year-old college student named Sanjay climbed up onto this boulder that was right off to the side of this hiking trail that he was on. Sanjay was on a day trip with about 20 of his friends from college, and they were in this part of southern India that was really famous for its long, winding trails and all these boulders that kind of sat off to the side of the trails. And then at the end of these trails that are in this part of India is this beautiful ancient Hindu temple that a lot of people will go and take pictures in front of and go inside of. And so that was where Sanjay and his friends were ultimately headed, was this temple. And from the boulder that Sanjay had just climbed up on, he looked up the trail, and from his view now, which was now slightly higher, he could actually see just barely the top of this temple. And so he was really excited about going to see it, and he couldn't believe how close they were. But as he was standing on this boulder, staring at the top of the temple, he also realized that kind of off to the side of the temple, basically right next to it, was this beautiful pool of water with a big wall around it and cement steps leading into it. I mean, it kind of looked like a swimming pool. And so because Sanjay and his friends had been hiking all day to this point, and it was really hot out, Sanjay really liked the idea of going swimming. And so he actually jumped off the boulder and just started running towards the temple and this pool, and he was yelling to his friends as he did, like, hey, I'm gonna go swimming. And so he ran, not to the temple, but to this random pool of water that was next to it, and he got to the steps, and he immediately took off his shirt, and he pulled his phone out of his pocket, and he put it on the steps, and then he walked his way into the water and turned around, hoping to see his friends coming after him. And sure enough, all of his friends were smiling and laughing and running after him, ripping their shirts off, putting their phones down, and jumping in too. And so pretty soon, this very quiet, peaceful pool next to this temple was packed full of very rowdy and crazy college kids. Now, to be clear, this pool of water was not intended to be a swimming area. It was dug about 300 years earlier for this temple, and many people began to view this pool of water as sacred because they believed it could cure diseases. And so what Sanjay and his friends were doing was totally taboo and not allowed. But I can promise you, Sanjay and his friends did not care. They were having a great time. And in fact, Sanjay was having such a great time that when he turned around and looked back up the steps they'd all charged in on, he saw one of his friends, whose name was Vishwas, was standing up out of the water reading what looked like a plaque about this pool of water. And Sanjay hated the idea of one of their buddies not getting to experience this fun. And so Sanjay, a little out of pocket, yelled out to Vishwas like, hey, stop reading that and get in the water. Let's go. What are you doing? And Vishwas was obviously kind of embarrassed to be called out so publicly in front of the, 19 other kids that were there. They're all looking up at him expectantly now, like, yeah, get in here, man. And Vishwas, he's like, okay, fine. And so he took off his shirt, put his phone down as well, and he got in the water with all of them. And very shortly after he did that, Sanjay kind of forgot about him and decided, hey, this would be a great time to take a photo of everybody here, memorialize this amazing trip. And so Sanjay, he waded over to the steps, he grabbed his phone, he came back towards the group, and he's looking at this big rowdy crowd of his friends who were totally not paying attention to him.
And he's saying, hey guys, come over here. I want to take your photo. Gather up. I'll take a photo of all of us. And so it took a couple of minutes, but eventually, all these kids got in frame, and Sanjay, he held the phone out, made sure everybody was there, and they all smiled, and he took a picture. And then after he took the picture, Sanjay put his phone back on the steps and returned to just splashing and goofing around with his friends. About an hour later, Sanjay and his friends had left the pool and were now in the temple and were just walking around exploring. But eventually, Sanjay just got tired of looking inside the temple. It was not very interesting to him. And so he eventually just went outside again and sat down on this low wall that was right outside the temple. And because he knew his friends would not be done for at least, 15 or 20 minutes or so, he just pulled out his phone and began kind of scrolling through social media and, doing what we all do on our phones. But eventually, Sanjay opened up his photo album to look at all the photos he had taken during the hike in, and then also that picture in the pool, and then also some pictures he took inside of the temple. And so he pulls up his pictures and just kind of starts scrolling through them, and he eventually reaches the photo that he took selfie style in the pool with all of his friends together. And so he opens that picture up and he looks at it and he smiles because it definitely was the best picture he took. He got all his buddies in frame. Everybody seemed so happy. But as Sanjay was looking at this photo, he realized there was something odd about it. There was just something in this photo that just seemed like it shouldn't be. And as he looked more closely at it, the smile on his face faded and he began to panic just a little bit. He didn't know if what he was looking at was real or not, but he knew he had to go find out. And so Sanjay put his phone away and he looked up and began looking around outside the temple at all the other people who had left, and many of them included his friends. And they were walking around, talking in groups or whatever. And Sanjay, he began looking at all of his friends and he would stare at their faces. He was looking for something, but he didn't see what he was looking for. And so after scanning the entire outside and not feeling satisfied, Sanjay got up and speed walked back into the temple and began going into each and every room, looking at every single person he encountered. And when he would find one of his friends, he would stare at their face. And when he didn't find what he was looking for, he just kept on going to every single room until finally he reached the last room of the temple and he found the last of his friends and he looked at their faces and still he did not see what he was looking for. And so now Sanjay is truly panicked. He's actually horrified at this point. He runs back outside and he finds their college professor who had come along to sort of chaperone the trip. And he ran up to this professor and he pulled out his phone. He opened up that photo of them in the pool. And Sanjay pointed out the strange thing about this photo. And so the professor, he began looking at the photo too. And right away, he also could see this very strange thing that seemed very out of place. And so the professor asked Sanjay a few follow-up questions, about like what Sanjay had done since discovering this. And after Sanjay said, I've been all over the temple. I still can't figure it out. And so the professor knew the police would have to get involved. And so the professor got in touch with police, and so the police came out to the temple not long after that, and the students, so Sanjay and all of his friends, had been instructed to stay right by the temple. Do not go down to the pool, stay up here, let the police handle it. And so when the police came in, they came running by the group, and Sanjay and his friends were just kind of watching anxiously, waiting to see what happens. And then as the officers went down to the pool, from where Sanjay and his friends were standing, they actually did not have a clear view. The temple itself blocked their view, so they could not see the pool. But they could hear what the officers were doing. And at first, as Sanjay and his friends are standing there really nervously, they don't hear anything down at the pool. But then they hear one of the officers shout something out, like he's found something. And then Sanjay and his friends heard all this splashing as clearly officers were jumping into the pool. And it was at this moment when Sanjay heard that splashing that he knew the thing he saw in this photo, it had to be real. As horrible as that was, it had to be real. The reason why Sanjay's friend, Vishwas, was not in the water with everybody else, why he was up reading that plaque about the history of this pool, was because Vishwas did not know how to swim, but he didn't tell anyone. Nobody knew this. And so he was probably kind of embarrassed about it. And so maybe he was reading this plaque as sort of a way to, act distracted, like the plaque is the reason he's not swimming. But then when Sanjay, who meant no harm by this, but he yelled out to Vishwas, "Hey, come on, dude, get in here. Come swimming with us." Because he did it so publicly in front of all the other friends, it seems like Vishwas felt very pressured into getting into the water. And that's what he did. Instead of telling anybody that he could not swim, he just kind of shrugged, took off his shirt, pulled his phone out of his pocket, put it on the ground, and waded into the water. And as soon as he did, the entire group just kind of went back to goofing around and splashing and being totally chaotic. And then when Sanjay was like, hey, let's take that photo, he really did manage to get all of his friends in frame somehow. Except one of them was Vishwas, and you can only see the top of his head. It's because he was drowning in the background of that photo, just nobody knew it. And so obviously, an hour later, when Sanjay's looking at this photo, he sees the top of Vishwas's head, and he's like, wait a minute, is he goofing around or is he drowning? And then he ran all around the temple looking for Vishwas. He wanted to prove that he was not in the pool still, that he was up here. But then after searching the entire area and not finding Vishwas, he went to his professor, they called the police, and the discovery was made. And unfortunately, by the time police pulled Vishwas out of the water, he was already deceased.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.